Struggling to make your private practice more profitable? The Profit First Academy by Green Oak Accounting is designed just for therapists, helping you boost profits, pay yourself confidently, and take control of your finances.
Join today for just $54 a month at profitfirstfortherapists.com/academy.
Feeling overwhelmed as a leader or helping professional in these chaotic times? You're not alone. Finding clarity and mentorship can be the key to avoiding burnout and stepping into your role as a leader. Our very own Katie Vernoy is offering dedicated strategy sessions to help you navigate these challenges.
Visit evolvetothriveconsulting.com/modern therapist to learn more.
You're listening to the Modern Therapist Survival Guide, where therapists live, breathe, and practice as human beings. To support you as a whole person and a therapist, here are your hosts, Curt Widhelm and Katie Vernoy.
Welcome back, Modern Therapists. This is the Modern Therapist Survival Guide. I'm Curt Widhelm with Katie Vernoy, and this is the podcast for therapists about the things that come up in our practices, the things that happen behind the scenes for therapists. And we have talked about working with suicide in a number of our previous episodes and had some varying conversations around it over the years. And one of the things that we've run into, a couple of our listeners have talked with us about, is Curt and Katie, you've had some podcasts about working with suicidal clients. You've had some podcasts about working successfully with them. What happens when you don't? So today we are joined by Dr. Nina Gutin. She's a psychologist. And when we looked up resources on what to do when a client dies by suicide, Nina's name was all over a lot of the search results that we found. And she has been very kind to join us today and to talk about what that process is like.
We're so glad to have you, Dr. Gutin. Nina, it's nice to meet you and to start this conversation. The way we start all of our interviews is with this question: who are you and what are you putting out into the world?
Well, I'm a psychologist. I'll start by saying I lost my brother to suicide in 1995. Since then, I've worked with a lot of other survivors in general, and then clinician survivors who experience both losses that are personal and losses that are professional, i.e. of clients or patients. And that has become sort of a specialty area. And so what I hope to put out into the world is to make use of my own experience and what I've learned from others in order to create support and resources for other survivors and clinician survivors.
We've also had past episodes on what to do when a client dies, and I think we barely touched on something around suicide in that episode, and we'll link to that in our show notes over at mtsgpodcast.com. I'm going to sidestep our normal first question here where we ask about, what do clinicians get wrong? Because I can only imagine that when we find out that a client has successfully completed a suicide attempt, that there is just a world of feelings and very little guidance and a whole lot of self-assigned blame that ends up happening there. So I'm wondering if you can start off just by speaking, what's kind of the typical reactions that somebody is already going through that hopefully normalizes this? But I don't want this to be a normal thing, but just to not have people feel so alone.
One thing I want to mention in terms of language, because within the suicide field, it's always shifting and changing. So even though completed suicide was brought up as an alternative to committed suicide, we realize that too has some connotations. So the word that we're using now generally is died by suicide. So that's just one aside. But I think you're sort of mentioning the concept of wrong is very pertinent, because especially given all of the messaging about suicide prevention, and initially even Zero Suicide had put out the term suicide is always preventable. They've since backed down from that. But the implications of that is that if suicide is preventable and a suicide happens, then, someone must be to blame. And so it isn't uncommon for clinicians who've experienced the loss, and I'm going to use the word client, to feel blameworthy and a lot of guilt, whether or not it's warranted. And I want to say that this is actually it's an occupational hazard, and the stats show that about 1 in 5 mental health professionals, with the exception of psychiatrists, which I'll talk about in a second, will lose a client to suicide over the course of their career. For psychiatrists, it's 1 in 2. So this is in fact an occupational hazard, but because it never gets talked about, it's treated like an aberration. So when this happens, oh, well, this person was in treatment, therefore the person who was treating them must have done something wrong. And that very easily gets internalized by the treating clinician. And we know that clinicians can do everything right and still lose clients to suicide, but that messaging doesn't get out there. So in addition to the guilt, one of the things to realize about losing anyone to suicide, but certainly a client to suicide, is that it's a traumatic loss. And therefore, it's not just the intense grief, but trauma symptoms are also very, very common after this loss. And I'll talk about that more. I'm guessing there might be questions on that. Impact a clinician, not only personally, but in professional domains as well.
I think for me, the fear of having a client die by suicide is pretty high. I know we've talked recently in some episodes we've recorded more recently about high intensity caseloads, about different types of diagnoses that have suicide in their profile more frequently or suicidal ideation in their profile more frequently. And I think for a lot of clinicians, it's seen as, I don't even know if it's right to say this, but I'm going to say what's coming into my head because I don't want to be shaming, but I also know that I want to name the fear, but that this is kind of the ultimate failure, that we've somehow failed our client. And we can know, looking at another clinician and having them talk through or consult with us about their experience and know that they've done everything they could and it was not their failure. That's not the right word. And so how do you address those things, or what are the things that clinicians can expect as far as how they can start processing through whether they are to blame or not? Is it, justified or not that they feel self-blame? What does that look like? And that those initial stages, I guess.
The initial stage, and it's complicated in a clinical setting because often what happens is they're not only having their own guilt, but implicitly or explicitly, other colleagues, other staff, supervisors might be blaming them as well. Again, whether or not it's warranted at all. And so in that context, it's hard to even reflect on whether or not it's warranted. And I think this is true for survivors in general. And I think the guilt and the blame serves a couple of purposes. One is because these losses are so filled with ambiguities, so many questions that cannot be answered. In some ways, guilt and blame can actually help deal with the ambiguity by saying, oh, I did it or they did it. And in some ways, it closes that circle that we as humans, we're not very good at tolerating ambiguity. But in terms of dealing with it, I'm going to quote Jack Jordan, who's a very esteemed colleague of mine, who talked about how in the guilt after a suicide loss is linked to what he calls the tyranny of hindsight. That is, we assume in the aftermath of a suicide loss that we should have known then what we know now, when in fact, then we did the best that we could without knowing what the potential outcome would be. One of the things I think in terms of self-care, if you feel like the incessant guilt, I made a mistake, I did this, I did that. And yes, in some ways, even if there was a mistake or you recognize that there was something missed, it's something to be learned from because no one doesn't make mistakes. And again, there's no way we could have known otherwise. If we're recognizing that the voices of the blame are only that of a prosecutor, to say, if there was a defense attorney, what would she, he, or they say? And in some ways, start the process of self-reflecting. Okay, is this truly legitimate? Are there other things that might have been in play? Like, was the client too afraid to mention that they were imminently suicidal for fear of being hospitalized, which is a big one? There are a lot of reasons why suicidal clients don't give clinicians the whole story, and because there are very well-based fears about what will happen in the aftermath. So to be able to sort of make the story more complex and to be able to tolerate the ambiguity in the story can be helpful. And I'm going to quote another esteemed colleague, Paula Marchese, who talked about turning the guilt into either remorse or regret. I wish I had known then what I know now. But that process can't be forced, and it takes its own time. And as we know as therapists, it's about readiness to sort of really move into that type of reflection about our responses.
When you're talking about the feeling of prosecution, or like a prosecutor is standing across, I used to teach a lot of ethics classes. Amongst the first discussions and lectures that we would have would be about risk assessments and around all of the historical cases that have ended up in court. And I have to imagine that a lot of the first reaction is just to isolate, to not further incriminate yourself in case legal action is potentially on the horizon. And I'm wondering if you can speak to just how much more isolating and terrible that have a clinician feeling.
In addition to that fear, just the issues around confidentiality. You're not allowed to talk to anyone. You can't say anything to anyone about this. Often lawyers will say, oh, you're not even allowed to talk to the family. And so that itself creates a lot of isolation. And then on top of that, the fear of litigation drives that even deeper. Now, I just want to say a couple of lawyers who deal specifically with suicide cases have urged, in relation to reaching out to the family of the person who died by suicide, compassion over caution. And they found that compassionate outreach to the family, with the understanding that there might not be able to be a clear disclosure about the client's details until they know whether the family carries the privilege, actually reduces the likelihood of litigation and is more healing for both clinician and for the family members. So the whole mental health system is built around liability. And often the trainings for assessments are built around liability. And that's a whole other issue, but it's so built into the system that it's really hard for impacted clinicians or staff, if it's like a community mental health or something like that, to feel worthy of blame and shame.
Private practice owners, do you feel like you're working hard but not seeing the profits you deserve? The Profit First Academy by Green Oak Accounting is here to change that. Designed exclusively for therapists, this program is built on the proven Profit First framework to help you take control of your finances and grow your business sustainably.
With step-by-step coaching, live Q&As with Profit First expert Julie Harris, and direct access to accountants who specialize in private practice, you'll get everything you need to build a profitable, thriving practice. And the best part? It's just $54 a month with no long-term commitment. Sign up today at profitfirstfortherapists.com/academy.
In that isolation, I feel like there's a lot of self-reflection that can happen, whether it's healthy or not. I feel like there's also this element of reevaluating who you are as a clinician. There's a lot of professional identity things I think would come up. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, this has such an impact on our clinical identities as well as our work in the short term. what's normative after this is a loss of confidence and a sense of competence. And to the extent that we're blaming ourselves, we start to question whether or not we should even stay in the field. And I lost my brother when I was in graduate school. And, before that, I was working clinically at a couple of jobs and was getting pretty good reviews and was starting to feel like, oh, maybe I did have something to offer. But after this is like, what right do I have to be doing this work when I couldn't even save my own brother? And again, when you talk about losing a client, it makes people question whether or not to even stay in the profession. In some ways, the self-reflection is so tied to the guilt and the blame and the failure, as opposed to being able to move out of that loop into saying, oh, I realize this is an occupational hazard. But unlike for medical doctors who know that death is inevitable in this work, since our field doesn't acknowledge that, there might be other ways to think about that. And I'll talk more about resources in a bit.
I watched a good friend who, in her practice, had lost a client in recent months. And just watching the process that she went through was, as a good friend and as a good friend of therapists, I'm imagining that she was more open in talking with me about things than most, but there was still just very much a wading through life kind of thing that I'm trying to imagine, still balancing a rest of a caseload and wrestling with this. Should I even be doing this? And particularly for those clinicians who are working with other high risk cases at the same time. I'm hoping that part of your answer is, you have a good support network as far as being able to talk about these kinds of things. But how does one realistically continue to work and show up in this process?
It's really difficult, which is why, we have advice for supervisors to advocate for either cutting caseload or making it consist of less, quote, high-risk clients, because at least in the short term, again, what's pretty normal after this loss for clinicians is that our clinical work is impaired. And it can range from sort of hypervigilance around suicide to a denial, and almost like it's too much. I need to deny that it's there. People notice all sorts of changes in their clinical work. I remember when I was working with clients with loss issues, I couldn't access my own empathy because all of my defenses were tied up in defending against that. And to know that some of these aspects are normal and that they're a result of the intensity and the trauma of the loss can be helpful in the short run. And to be able to either self-advocate or have someone else advocate for you to say, until I'm able to process this more, heal more, if I can get a reduction in, again, this sort of intense caseload, that would be great. Because how can it not impact not only our identities, but the work that we do, especially when it's so close? If we're working with other high-risk clients, we're going to feel like we're working on a tightrope, even more so than we were before. So I would say just knowing that it's normal and seeing what can be done to give ourselves a little respite. And of course, to ideally try to find someone who has had a similar experience to cut down on that sense of isolation. Because again, even though it's unfortunately very frequent, nobody talks about it because it's so filled with shame.
You spoke about resources, and my assumption is that some of the resources are groups, Facebook groups, different things where clinicians who've had a client die by suicide, those things might be present. Can you share some of those at this point?
Yeah, well, the one that I'm most familiar with is one that I've been involved with since about 2003, initially with one of my colleagues, Vanessa McGann, and it's currently called the Coalition of Clinician-Survivors. And we both lost siblings. And I'd done a presentation and written a little article in which I talked about not only about the sequelae of the loss, but how in the clinical world, there was almost a tendency to pathologize the reaction to the loss. So when I presented on that, I had people come out of the woodwork and said, "Oh, I had the same experience." And so Vanessa reached out to me and said, I also shared that experience. And so since then, we've decided that both for clinicians who've had personal losses, but certainly for clinicians who've lost clients, there needs to be a place, a space where people can share experiences without breaking confidentiality if it's a client loss, but to go on our listserv and say, "What's going on?" And other people will say, "Yes, I had that same experience." So it will cut down on the sense of isolation and alienation. And we have on our website, which I can give you that information momentarily, we've got a bibliography, and I'll credit John McIntosh for keeping that up to date, and personal testimonies from people who have had both types of loss, both personal and clinical losses, so that people can know that they're not alone and can learn from each other. And once you're become a member of our coalition, and it's free, there's no cost, there are a couple of people who are actually running both open and closed 10-week groups that people can have access to. So if they want something a little more intense. Those are some of the resources. It's not one of ours, but I've been told there's a Facebook group for clinicians who've lost clients. There are resources, and hopefully they're becoming easier to find.
Are you exhausted and overwhelmed by the constant change and chaos? You're not alone. When the world feels like it's crashing down, people look to therapists and leaders for support. But who's supporting you? The pressure can be isolating, and without the right guidance, burnout is just around the corner.
That's where Katie Vernoy comes in. With years of experience mentoring leaders and helping professionals, she's offering dedicated strategy sessions to help you find clarity, confidence, and a clear path forward. Whether you're struggling with burnout, career decisions, crisis management, or even navigating the ever-changing landscape of mental health care, Katie will help you create a plan that works for you.
Don't go through this alone. Visit evolvetotthriveconsulting.com/modern therapist to learn more. I think for me, the isolation is a huge part. It sounds like that's something where these types of resources are really, really helpful. I also just, having had some of my own traumatic losses, not by suicide, other things, I recognize that the grief process can be very complicated. And I imagine in this case, whether it's a close family member who's died by suicide or a client who's died by suicide, it's extremely complex. Can you talk a little bit about the grief process here? Because this seems like it would be fairly intense for a clinician, especially a clinician who was very close to a client that's died by suicide or has had a family member who's died by suicide.
Yeah, and I think both the intensity and the complexity are complicated by the stigma around suicide. And there's also a lot of research that shows that that stigma is directed towards survivors. And I think I just want to say that I also think within our field, there's what I'll just call professional stigma, which is directed towards colleagues who not only experience but dare to display any type of vulnerability, because it breaks what I think is sort of this us-them distinction. We are the healers, we're the strong ones, they are the ones with vulnerability. So what happens when one of us becomes one of them? So the suffering clinician tends to bear the brunt of everyone else's projections. So I think there's the stigma, there's the grief of the loss, And I know many clinicians who have sort of lost long-term clients where they have very deep relationships. And that, again, it's hard to acknowledge with all of the confidentiality issues and the intertwining with the trauma symptoms that are normative after this. So all of those together make it more intense, more complex than other types of loss. And two, I think it can help to know what's normative because often people will say, I feel like I'm going crazy because the intensity can be so disorienting. But the more people know that, no, they're not going crazy. This is understandably what happens after this loss. And you're dealing with a lot of different issues coming from a lot of different directions. And again, knowing that you're not alone in this and that there are other people who have been there and have healed and now have something to offer can offer hope that one is not going to be in this sort of disorganized, disenfranchised state forever.
Due to the timing of the loss of your sibling and going through all of your training in this field, I'm imagining that you have such a unique, different perspective on how suicide has been talked about throughout your career and what's just missing in the way that those clinicians who haven't experienced that kind of loss seem to approach this. And I'm going through the Coalition of Clinician-Survivors website here as we're talking. And I love all of the postvention resources that you have on here, and everyone should go and check this out. But I'm also kind of torn as far as people should go and check this out before they ever run into this. And I'm wondering, just kind of through your career and your process, is this something where it's just kind of been received by even clinicians in trainings that's just kind of like, oh, yeah, that's something that we'll get to when we deal with that, but that's not something that's affected me yet?
Where we get more pushback is from organizations who say, oh, no, we do things pretty well. We don't need that. And then only call us, when there is a suicide. And so one of the things that we really advocate is to have what we call postvention protocols in place. And that means like to have guidelines and resources available should something like this happen before it happens, rather than scrambling to pull things together in the aftermath. So that's why we got people who've really developed good protocols and are willing to share them up on our website. Those protocols not only help explain to people in an agency, for instance, how to best support impacted clinicians and staff, but they also talk about the importance of not blaming and shaming. And often in the aftermath of something like this occurs in an agency, there's what is variously called either a psychological autopsy or some sort of way to sort of look at what happened and to sort of look for gaps or oversights and to avoid blaming and shaming in that, because clinicians have said, I feel like I've just gone through a tribunal. But to the extent that there were things that could have been done better to identify, say, for instance, gaps in training, and then to sort of see those as something to be corrected rather than blaming a clinician for not being trained in something that, if they had been trained in, maybe there might have been a different outcome. Of course, we will never know because that's all like the hindsight stuff.
So even when you're talking about approaching agencies or potentially groups of clinicians and saying, postvention, have a plan, understand what the risks are, get yourself together so that you can manage these things if they happen. The response is, well, we do a good job. This isn't going to happen to us, which still speaks to that bias and it speaks to that blame. And so I'm curious, when you're successfully able to break through that and get to agencies, group practices, individuals who are really wanting to have this as part of their, and I'll say it because it's the name of our podcast, their survival guide, what is the orientation to take? What can clinicians do before they face this to really get themselves in a place that this isn't going to destroy them?
Well, first of all, to know that it is, in fact, an occupational hazard, to know that, again, I mentioned before that even when they do everything right, if they've been well trained, if they've been able to deal with their own fears, anxieties, biases, etc., around suicide, and feel like they can put out their best work, they might still lose clients to suicide. And that's the reality. So in some ways, similar to training in med school, when people know that they can do their best, and still lose their patients, optimally to have similar training about this in place before this happens, so that when it happens, it can lift some of that shame and self-blame in order to be able to more freely reflect on what happened, and to be more likely to say, well, I think I followed all the protocols, I covered all the bases, I asked the right questions, and this happened. And, to be able to that's a different perspective than, oh my God, I screwed up.
Can you tell people where they can find all of the wonderful resources that you and others have put together so that way, if they are facing this stuff, they're not doing this all alone for the first time?
Our website for the Coalition of Clinician-Survivors is cliniciansurvivor.org. And on that website, you can find the testimonials, the bibliography, the postvention resources, and a few other things. And the other thing, there are opportunities to join our listserv. On the listserv, what people can do is introduce themselves. And if people want to be extremely anonymous, we can actually use an alias for them so that we can post what they would want using the alias on their behalf, but they'd still be able to see the replies. And once they introduce themselves and talk a little bit about their loss and the circumstances and what's going on, inevitably they're going to get lots of support from other clinicians who've been in the same position. And that's both for clinicians who've experienced personal and or professional losses. I just want to put out a caveat that it might take a little while between submitting the form and getting enrolled, just because it's all volunteer. No one's being paid. We're all trying to do this on top of everything else. So there's usually some lag time until we can sort of get to that enrollment. So just don't feel that we've forgotten you. We're just trying to balance this with all of the other things in our lives.
Do you also have a way that they can contact you if they would like to reach out to you for some consultation?
Sure. I can give my email, which is ngutin, that's ngutin at earthlink.net.
And we will include links to all of those in our show notes over at mtsgpodcast.com. And follow us on our social media, Facebook, Instagram, join our Facebook group, the Modern Therapist group, to continue on with this conversation. And until next time, I'm Curt Whithelm with Katie Vernoy and Dr. Nina Gutin.
Want to make your private practice more profitable? Join the Profit First Academy for just $54 a month and start taking control of your finances today. Visit profitfirstfortherapists.com/academy to sign up.
Need guidance in these challenging times? Katie Vernoy is offering special strategy sessions to help you navigate your career. Don't go it alone. Get the support you need. Learn more at evolvedwiththriveconsulting.com/modern therapist.
Thank you for listening to the Modern Therapist Survival Guide. Learn more about who we are and what we do at mtsgpodcast.com. You can also join us on Facebook and Twitter. And please don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss any of our episodes.